Okay, so this is the video for the Psycholinguistics module in Linguistics 102. That's chapter 13 in the current edition of the textbook. This module is the first one where we get really solidly into the life cycle of scientific investigation into language. We have the first section of this chapter is on the methods of psycholinguistic research. The second section is on key results from that research. And the third section builds those results into models so that we can depict how we think language processing happens. So it's very much, the methods, and then getting data, and then trying to learn patterns from that data. So in the methods section, one of the first things that we come across is a distinction between two different types of methods. There are field methods on the one hand and experimental methods on the other. And this is a central distinction across a lot of sciences, social sciences and otherwise. The difference between going out and watching stuff happen, that's field methods where you're not manipulating the thing you're observing, and experiments where you are changing the conditions and seeing how that affects the phenomenon that you observe. And we'll see these distinctions in various areas. We see that we use them in various areas of linguistic research. So a very popular field method in psycholinguistic research is slips of the tongue, or the little errors we make. There's a lot of ways that you can speak in a way that isn't consistent with the normal grammar of the language. And notice I'm using a very descriptive approach here. I'm not saying ways you can speak that are wrong, but that aren't consistent with the normal grammar, right? And slips of the tongue, there's some really neat examples in the textbook of how fun they can be, but also what the nature of those errors can tell us about the processing of language in the brain. What sorts of things do get swapped out for each other or mixed up, and what sorts of things don't. In experimental methods, we get into a few specific methods, lexical decision tasks, priming tasks, and some EEG, electroencephalogram things, as well as a couple of others. It's very important to note that these are in no way an exhaustive view of the different methods available to linguists that are studying the processing of language, the psycholinguistic dynamics there. But it's a good start, and especially lexical decision tasks. These are a very common kind of a mainstay of a lot of the core of psycholinguistic research over the decades. And you can start to see as you read through this, that it gets very specific, right? When you're doing a scientific experiment, you're very carefully trying to identify what it is you're interested in, identify how you can measure that, and go through and operationalize and really make something that you can study, a study that you can conduct, where you know that the answers will tell you something about how the phenomenon works, how language works. And so we get some interesting data here. The last section here is on Languagecorpora and databases. This is an area that's really exploded in the 20-some years since I started doing linguistics. It's got from the point where at one point it would take millions of dollars to conduct a project to assemble a database, a corpus of written texts that has the kind of structure you would need to study linguistic patterns. And now electronic text is everywhere. It's some work to sort of assemble and curate it, but it's nowhere near as difficult to get a big collection of data that you can look at. But corpora aren't just text, aren't just written language, they are spoken language. There are parallel corpora where you might have multiple languages, or you might have text corresponding with speech, that text read aloud or that speech transcribed. And these can all be used to investigate different questions. Anyway, little section there that sort of opens that that book, that sort of avenue of research a little bit. And then we go on to the section, what are some things that we've found? What are some patterns that we've learned about how we process sounds, the phonetics and the phonology of language, in terms of psychological reality of phonetic features, of segments, of syllables, morphological processing patterns that we see. So we talk in the earlier section, you learn about priming experiments. Can we prime individual morphemes, or is it at the word level? Things like that. How is that affected by different morphological properties of words, like transparency and productiveness and whatnot? So a lot of interesting results there. And then we also look at some results in terms of syntactic structures. Syntactic complexity is a big thing that people look at. Okay, and having some results in hand, we then look to what do we do with that? We have an experimental result. It seems to tell us something. How can we start putting together a larger picture? Language, throughout Linguistics 101, we talk about different aspects of language, the sounds, the morphology, the syntax, the semantics. In this course, we look at the social side and the development of languages over time and acquisition of language and all of that. And the fact is that within each of us, most of these aspects of language are always active, right? When I'm speaking, I'm doing sounds, I'm doing morphology, I'm doing syntax, I'm doing social things. I'm modulating the words I select and the way I put them together based on my perception of the audience and what I want to convey about my own identity. And all of this is happening together. So what we do is we use often these graphical models to sort of identify modules of processing and see how information flows from one to the other in order to depict our understanding, as it's informed by these results, of how the whole picture of language works in the minds of language users. And so we learn, we have a couple of terms about different ways that we can put these models together in terms of serial or parallel processing, and the idea of taking these models and maybe even implementing them in a computer model, into a computer program that can then maybe give us a deeper picture of how this idea, this hypothesis of language processing may play out. And yeah, then what do we do once we have a model? What do we do with it? So there's some ideas of critiquing models. How do we identify which one is right? What does it mean for a model to be right? Because until a model is an actual physical thinking, language using brain, it's not going to be a complete picture of how things interact with the brain. So how does that work? And where do we go from there? So we end with some nice sort of broad picture, broad stroke things. Psycholinguistics is the application of psychological methods and reasoning to linguistic questions. Psychology is the study of human behavior, so it's this very big tent field. Language is one of the behaviors. It's one set of behaviors that humans engage in. So in a certain sense, linguistics is a subset of psychology. And what we see in this is some psychological methods being applied to investigating language. And it's a little different from what we've seen before, but I hope that reading through this chapter, looking at the examples that we have, trying out some practice problems will give you a different way of maybe thinking about what linguistics is and how we investigate, how we find out the stuff that you have been learning since you started studying linguistics. You've been learning facts about language. How do we find them out? This chapter is giving us part of the answer to that. Anyway, that's all for this video. Thanks for watching.